when he when he and 8 other mentally healthy adults gained admission to psychiatric units in 5 different American states. They all used a pre-agreed plan. They told the admitting psychiatrist that they could hear a voice in their head, and it was saying the word thud, THUD. That was it, nothing more. Each was admitted with a diagnosis of serious mental illness, including schizophrenia. Once in the hospitals, they all behaved normally. They were all kept for 2 to 6 weeks and administered antipsychotic drugs. They had expected to be kept in for just a few days, but the more normal they behaved, the worse it got. Telling the doctors that they were sane and part of an experiment just made things worse. They were only allowed out when they admitted that they were insane and that they were getting better. But that's not the end of it. After Dr. Rosenhan himself was finally released and published his report, one of the hospitals delivered him a challenge. They requested he repeat the experiment, only this time they would spot the fakes. Rosenhan agreed, and the hospital reported in the national media that it had spotted 41 such fakes this time. Rosenhan then revealed he had sent nobody at all. So, how did all these understandable reactions to life experiences become deemed psychiatric illnesses? Staggeringly, 1 in 5 people in the United States now has a mental health diagnosis. How did a natural and understandable reaction to life, like grief, for example, make it into the DSM? Let's look a little further. Following the humiliation of the Rosenhan experiment, psychiatry was struggling for credibility with other medical fields. In the last 2 centuries, all other areas of medicine have made huge improvements. Germ theory and antibiotics ushered in a new era of healthcare, and diseases that had baffled doctors for hundreds of years are now routinely cured and prevented with screening and vaccinations. As disease-focused medicine improved, the number of sick and dying has decreased and life expectancy increased. But sadly, not so with psychiatry. As the number of psychiatric diagnoses increases and drug sales go up, the number of people needing help and claiming mental health disability payments has soared. The mental health field is full of caring and dedicated professionals who are struggling under the load of trying to help their clients and patients, leading to an incredibly high burnout rate for people in the caring professions. But what if the same thing that is burning out our doctors, nurses, and social workers is the same thing that is distressing the people they're trying to help? What if it's the very treatments that are making the problem worse and not better? What if there is a misunderstanding that sits behind how all of our experience is created?
Nice intro. Lovely. Okay, so moving on to page 8. A chemical imbalance, the myth. My friend in New York had refused to believe that they have found no evidence of a chemical imbalance. She had looked at me as if I was the crazy one for even suggesting it. I tried to explain that it was an analogy that had no scientific proof. But even when I told her that, prominent psychiatrists from the APA and FDA were now admitting it was never true. She, like a great majority of the general public, could not and would not believe me. I have had this experience many times, and it fascinates me why so many of us want to believe a theory that even Dr. Ronald Pies, editor-in-chief of Psychiatric Times, described in 2011 as an urban legend. In the introduction to a landmark study published in Molecular Psychiatry in 2022, Dr. Julia Moncrief et al. State, The idea that depression is the result of abnormalities in brain chemicals, particularly serotonin, has been influential for decades and provides an important justification for the use of antidepressants. Dr. Moncrief goes on to explain that after very comprehensive investigation into decades of research, there is no in capital letters, convincing evidence that depression is associated with or caused by lower serotonin concentrations or activity. So how did such an unscientific and ill-proved theory become so embedded in our collective psyche? At the start of the 1950s, neuroscientists debated whether the brain worked via electrical connections or chemical messengers. In the words of Robert Whitaker, one award-winning author of Anatomy of an Epidemic, the chemical guys won. And so serotonin and dopamine entered our understanding of how the brain works. In 1955, Bernard Brody, a researcher from the National Institute of Health, confirmed the theory of the chemical imbalance after giving reserpine, an herbal drug used in India for depression, to rats, which in turn made them lethargic and apathetic. It was noted that reserpine also reduced dopamine and serotonin. The scientists concluded, in parentheses, or presumed, that it must be the depleted dopamine and serotonin that caused depression. We're at the top of page 9. Does anybody want to take over reading?
Mary, would you like to? Or if not, I will.
Well, I will, but I don't know the two, how to pronounce the two medications here, but the scientists then discovered that if the drugs, iproposide and impropeline, I'm sure I'm destroying those names, were given first, the animals wouldn't become depressed. They therefore surmised that these drugs prevented depression. By the 1960s, scientists at the NIMH believed that they had discovered how these drugs worked in the brain synapses, and the first generation of antidepressants were born. Robert Whitaker continues, quotations, in 1956, the NIMH's Joseph Schildkraut published a paper on American Journal of Psychiatry, which reviewed this body of research and set forth a chemical imbalance theory of affective disorders. Further research suggested that schizophrenia was caused by too much dopamine and that the drug thorazine disconnected certain brain regions. Quotations, the revolution in mental health care that Congress had hoped for when it created the NIMH 20 years earlier was now, or so it seemed, complete. Psychiatric drugs had been developed that were antidotes to biological disorders, and researchers believed the drugs worked by countering chemical imbalances in the brain. Frank Berger, the creator of Milltown, parentheses, which you may remember from the HBO series Mad Men, parentheses, announced that they were adding to happiness, human achievement, and the dignity of man. But were they? In 1974, two researchers from the University of Pennsylvania took another look at Schildkraut's research. Mendels and Fraser found that only 6% of the patients given reserpine became depressed. Only 6%. This is not sufficient or reliable proof that there is a biological disorder or chemical imbalance in everyone who is depressed. When physicians in the UK gave it to their depressed patients, they reported that it lifted their spirits. One of the basics of all science is that the experiment has to be reliable and reproducible. One time can be written off as a fluke. So in order to be regarded as fact, it has to be reliably replicated, and this has never, ever been done. Their proof made as much sense as deducing that if my headache is relieved by taking an aspirin, then my brain must have been depleted of aspirin. The literature reviewed here strongly suggests that depletion of brain dopamine and serotonin is in itself not sufficient to account for the development of clinical syndrome of depression.
Here are some footnotes I'm going to read out to you. In 1967, 1 in 3 American adults filled a prescription for a psychoactive medication, with total sales reaching 692 million. By 2021, it was 378 billion with a B. There, and I think most of the people on the call are familiar with the it's not a movie, it's a video. I can't think of the descriptive word for it. That's called Medicating Normal. Documentary. That's the word I'm looking for. A documentary called Medicating Normal. Wow. It's a big wow. Should I keep reading? Or Wendy, you want to go?
Yeah, I'll take it. Yep. 10 years later, in 1984, the NIMH funded research into the low serotonin theory again. Lead investigator James Moss wrote, contrary to expectations, no, capital N, capital O, relationships were found. Elevations or decrements in the functioning of serotonergic system per se are not likely to be associated with depression. David Burns, a Stanford psychiatrist, I have never, capital N, capital E, capital V, capital E, capital R, seen any convincing evidence that any psychiatric disorder, including depression, results from a deficiency of brain serotonin. And Colin Rose of Southwest Medical Center Dallas says, quote, there is no, capital N, capital O, scientific evidence whatsoever that clinical depression is due to any kind of biological deficit state. And Hannah writes, all that was her emphasis for the no and the never. So why do we still believe it's true? For years, I have been reading how the chemical imbalance theory has no solid scientific proof, and yet I hear my clients say all the time that they've been told by their doctors, even therapists, that there was something wrong with their brains. Many of the people whose stories you will read in this book were told that they had a chemical imbalance, that their brains weren't working correctly as an explanation for their anxiety, depression, and obsessive thoughts. Like millions of others, they were told they like millions of others, they were told they were ill and needed medication to correct it. I got curious. Are the doctors taught about a chemical imbalance in medical school as a fact? Or are they taught it's a way to explain something to their patients that they themselves don't really even understand or believe? In another paper co-authored by Dr. Joanna Moncrief in 2022, Moncrief investigates at great length all the references in scientific literature where the unproved theory of the chemical imbalance is given credit, including professional journals and university textbooks. It was everywhere. From the American Psychiatric Association's own website in 2005, quote, antidepressants may be prescribed to correct imbalances in the level of the chemicals in the brain, to one of the most used psychiatric textbooks, Essentials in Psychopharmacology, which devoted almost an entire section on the biological basis of depression to monoamines, including serotonin. Dr. Moncrief notes that medical journal papers confirming the theory were, quote, cited on average more than etiology reviews. For those of us who understand, etiology is sort of like you all know what it is, but I mean, so these papers that noted false evidence were quoted more than etiology sources. 400 citations are normal for a medical paper. Serotonin theory papers get as many as 2,413. not to mention newspapers, websites, and TV, both news and drama, where we are regularly given the message that our moods and our emotions are the result of defective brain chemistry.
Yowza. So, top of page 11, why are many medical students still being taught this? And why are psychiatrists still telling their patients it's true? As I was researching for this book, I looked up some statistics on the Center for Disease Control's website. The CDC is a U.S. government department. The tagline of the CDC is saving lives, protecting people. I suddenly noticed the following in a section called What is Mental Illness? On a list of what the CDC says causes mental illness was, you guessed it, a chemical imbalance. Mm-hmm. Wayne Goodman, academic psychiatrist and chair of the FDA's Psychopharmacological Committee, recently admitted that evidence of a neurochemical deficiency in people with depression was elusive, but described the chemical imbalance as a useful metaphor, although not one he would use with his patients. However, he still asserted that depression is a chemically or brain-based problem and that the medications are normalizing function, and maintained that the idea of a chemical imbalance was a reasonable shorthand to describe this situation. Goodman's reference to a useful metaphor is intriguing. No wonder the evidence is elusive. I had learned that the chemical imbalance metaphor came about as the result of scientists from drug companies needing a way to explain the very complicated way drugs work so their marketing people could understand. Marketing people. Picture the meeting. The drug company scientists talking to the characters in Mad Men. It's like, say, insulin for diabetics. There is like an imbalance. And so these drugs correct it, kind of. It seems the marketing guys took this analogy as truth and ran with it. You can see the original advert for Zoloft on YouTube. In this advertisement, it clearly says depression is a disease, and the words chemical imbalance appear on screen while cartoon nerves do a little dramatization of how they think it works. Zoloft works to correct this imbalance, says a kind and caring voice. But hold on a minute. If a child is told to eat his vegetables because they are like the fuel mommy puts in the car to make it go, and the child now believes broccoli and petroleum are the same thing, that's a bit of a problem. A caring adult would be quick to explain, it's just an analogy. Otherwise, all kinds of poisonous accidents could occur. So why has the psychiatric profession never corrected this misunderstanding? In 2011, Ronald Pies, editor-in-chief emeritus of Psychiatric Times and one of America's most prestigious psychiatrists, responded to a report published by the Citizens Commission on Human Rights. He dubbed the chemical imbalance theory of depression an urban legend and claimed no well-informed psychiatrist had ever believed it, since they understood the true biopsychosocial nature of mental disorders. Unfortunately, he continued, this had not been widely misunderstood. This had not been widely understood, and opponents of psychiatry mendaciously attribute the phrase to psychiatrists themselves. According to Pies, the theory had been propagated by the pharmaceutical industry alone and should be consigned to the dustbin of ill-informed and malicious caricatures. That's in quotes. And then in parentheses, maybe he should reread some of his university textbooks. Whoa, whoa. You want to take it from here, Mary?
Sure. In an article by Philip Hickey, PhD, he quotes Dr. Kenneth Kendall, MD, a professor of psychiatry and director of Virginia Institute of Psychiatric and Behavioral Genetics, who also worked on several DSMs, stating, quote, although the original articles proposing these theories are couched in qualifications, i.e. exceptions, as psychiatry resident in the late 1970s, I was taught these theories are monocausal explanation. Hickey goes on to say, Dr. Kendall did his psychiatry residency at Yale, during which he tells us he was taught the various chemical imbalance theories, presumably as valid factual explanations. As Dr. Moncrief observes, current attitudes reflect the paradoxical situation in which a chemical imbalance theory of depression is simultaneously endorsed and disowned. Not that, but in studies where they are deliberately reduce the levels of serotonin in non-depressed people, they do not become depressed. And yet the chemical imbalance theory is still put forward by professionals and formed the basis of considerable research. The general public widely believes that depression has been convincingly demonstrated to be the result of abnormalities, and this belief shapes how people understand their moods, leading to a pessimistic outlook, leading to lifelong dependence on these drugs. So it seems the scientists and psychiatrists are blaming the drug companies, but the drug companies are funding the scientists who give the information to the psychiatrists. My next question is, why is it that we are so willing to believe this myth? Why are we so ready to blame our biology for our moods and emotions? I asked this question to Dr. Moncrief, and she very generously emailed me this answer, quotation, really good question. I don't know, but a few thoughts. Most people do not think that this until the pharmaceutical industry set out to indoctrinate people in the 1990s. Intuitively, I think most people understand mental and emotional problems as reactions to life events and circumstances, not as brain chemical events. However, having said this, there is also a natural tendency to seek magical cures for everything. Potions, magical charms, patent medications, and medicines have become popular forever. The main reason people don't want to accept the truth that the chemical imbalance is fiction is that they have been indoctrinated and they don't want to admit this to themselves, even if they suspect it to be true. And it seems that we have been told to look in the wrong directions or the wrong place for an explanation of our mental and emotional problems. So in which direction should we look? Where is the right place to find the answers?
Great. We're moving right along. Chapter 3 in our book. No, chapter 4. So many symptoms, but what is the real cause? While looking for the answer to the question of how emotional experience is really created, one question always bothered me. Many entries in the DSM have a frequent overlap of symptoms. How can these be regarded as discrete and separate diseases if they share so many of the same symptoms? Another way to see this is comorbidity. Many patients are diagnosed with multiple diagnoses, many of which have the same symptoms. I was curious about this, so I looked up a few classifications in the DSM to find out what were the most common symptoms, only to find out that many diagnoses had all the same ones. Bipolar, for example, has many of the same symptoms as borderline personality disorder, and difficulty concentrating is a symptom of at least 16 different disorders. These very common symptoms are similar to the ones you can find on the Mayo Clinic website. if you search for, quote, mental illness. Here they are: feeling sad or down, confused thinking or reduced ability to concentrate, excessive fears or worries or extreme feelings of guilt, extreme mood changes of highs and lows, significant tiredness, low energy, or problems sleeping, sex drive changes, inability to cope with daily problems or stress, trouble understanding and relating to situations and people, problems with alcohol or drug use, major changes in eating habits, withdrawal from friends and activities, excessive anger, hostility, or violence, detachment from reality or delusions, paranoia or hallucinations, and suicidal thinking. So far, we've established with the help of some top medical professionals that a chemical imbalance is not the root cause of mental illness. So, what are these all too common mental health symptoms telling us about what's actually going on inside our minds? Are they even symptoms? Could it be that there is one source of mental distress causing these very human experiences? I have long been convinced that if you open the DSM to any page and pick a diagnosis, there will have been a history of prolonged, stressful thinking preceding it. When you read the personal stories in part 2, you will see over and over the progression of stressful thinking turning into anxiety, eventually escalating into severe mental distress, and then being labeled as a mental illness. I've wondered for many years if there could be a simpler explanation for all these symptoms, and then I discovered the work of Sydney Banks. Sydney Banks taught all over the world from the 1970s until he passed away in 2009 about what he called the three principles. Banks saw that mind, thought, and consciousness are the basic principles of how all psychology works. For over 30 years, he taught at universities, including MIT, wrote 6 books, and affected hundreds of thousands of people. When world famous scientist Dr. Candace Pert, author of the best selling book Molecules of Emotion, met Sydney Banks, she got on the floor and bowed at his feet. They first met at a conference on science and spirituality at Virginia University, and she later wrote, Sid mysteriously points the way to living in the present moment, feeling love and gratitude for life. In 2005, Sydney Banks wrote, there need only be one generic mental illness, an inability to see the role of thought. In a 2018 paper called All for One and One for All, Mental Disorders in One Dimension, published in the American Journal of Psychiatry, Dr. Avshalom Caspi, a well-respected academic PhD professor from Duke University, writes, in both child and adult psychiatry, empirical evidence has now accrued to suggest that a single dimension is able to measure a person's liability to mental disorder, comorbidity among disorders, persistence of disorders over time, and severity of symptoms. Could Dr. Caspi be agreeing that there is one cause of mental illness? Dr. Caspi starts the article by observing that it is well recognized that there are two primary dimensions to childhood disorders, what he calls internalizing, which means anxiety and depressive symptoms, and externalizing, which means aggressive, delinquent, and hyperactive or impulsive symptoms. In fact, our data suggests that a two-factor model could account for the comorbidity of different adult disorders. This initial finding led to the hypothesis that common DSM disorders in adults may be characterized by two underlying psychopathological processes: internalizing dimension, indicating liability to experience mood and anxiety disorders, such as a major depression, generalized anxiety disorder, panic disorder, and social phobia, and an externalizing dimension, indicating liability to experience substance abuse disorders and antisocial disorders. This is great progress. Instead of being told there are hundreds of disorders, we have an experienced academic psychologist saying that maybe there are only two. But like any good scientist in the search of truth, he goes further in this article and contemplates a deeper question.
Hey,
Go
Wendy,
ahead,
could
Lori.
you repeat those two, please?
Which two?
The,
The
the,
two
the-
the two
yes.
dimensions? Yeah. In fact, our data suggests that there's a two-factor model which could account for the comorbidity of different adult disorders. This initial finding led the hypothesis that common DSM disorders in adults may be characterized by two underlying psychopathological processes. Internalizing dimension is one, and externalizing dimension is the other. Internalizing dimension indicating a liability or a propensity to experience mood and anxiety disorders such as depression, generalized anxiety disorder, panic disorder, and social phobia. And the externalizing dimension makes you prone to experience substance abuse disorders and antisocial disorders.
Thank you. Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Lori, want to take it from this is great progress?
Yes. Anybody want to interject anything before I take it from here? Middle of page 16. I'll just say one quick thing, which is, and I think I said this before to this group, but to whoever else is listening, when I was in graduate school in my diagnosis class, I think Elaine said she had the same experience in her class. We all looked at each other and said, "Oh my God, I have that. I have that. I have that," because it's a continuum. All people go in and out of the same symptoms that are attached to certain diagnoses. It's very interesting. Okay,
And
middle of
Lori,
16.
wouldn't
Yeah.
it be interesting to take, I'm slightly familiar with DSM from my work in healthcare, but wouldn't it be interesting to take that book and to put it into each diagnosis and put it into one of those two camps that Wendy just read, right? Internal and external. I bet you it could be done. And
Yeah.
how beautiful if we just simplified it,
It
right?
would be such a narrow book, such a thin book, 10 pages or whatever, right? Yeah.
I'm thinking one page.
Yeah, right?
Yeah,
Right.
right,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
I like the one page that mental illness just has to do with the momentary misuse of the ability to think in the moment. It's not an illness. It's a yeah, when people start recognizing that, they won't scare themselves and they'll know to look in a more pleasant direction. There's always that capacity, a more pleasant direction than banging ourselves with
Yeah. And it
our
boils down
thinking.
to what my favorite part of the principles that I understand, how I internalize it. It's not the thinking that I have, it's not the thoughts that I have, it's my relationship and how much I want to
Exactly.
date them, become engaged to them, marry them, and then maybe divorce them. Like there's a progression of attachment that I might have to particular thoughts of doom and gloom or whatever. Um, and when I recognize it, I don't have to date any of them. They're just thoughts. They're
Yeah.
just guys walking across the street or whatever. I don't have to have a relationship with any of them.
Yeah.
And so I love that relationship piece. That helps me understand the principles the best. Yeah.
Yeah. The relationship we have to our own thinking, which comes from understanding. And that's why we're doing this book club. Yeah, right on, Wendy. So this knowledge gave rise to the new idea that there may be one underlying factor that summarizes individual propensity to develop any and all forms of common psychopathologies. Suppose there really is something substantive that accounts for meaningful variance across major forms of psychotherapy. But what is it? Dr. Caspi commented that there are two factors or two underlying psychopathological processes to explain human experience. He called them external and internal. Dr. Caspi is referring to external as behaviors that happen on the outside of us. He gives the example of substance abuse and antisocial disorders, drug addiction, self-harm, and violence certainly seem to be things that are happening outside of our personal minds. My abusive childhood caused me to overeat. My control freak partner makes me drink. These are all quotes, my narcissistic boss drives me crazy.
Now,
But what
Lori,
if they are
we thought
actually coming from the same source?
I was just going to be funny, Lori, and when you said
Let
my abusive childhood caused me to overeat, my control freak partner makes me drink, and you said you made sure that we knew that those were quotes, and I thought they were coming from you.
So let's go a little further upstream and find out. Most of us put the cart before the horse, and want to blame others, our situations, or our history for our emotional turmoil or destructive behaviors. Like many people, I always thought my struggles and anger were because of my childhood, being overwhelmed at work or the ex-boyfriend. Always thought that if those things or people were different, then I would be okay. How many of us have thought, if only they would change, then I'd be okay. If only it was different, then I'd be happy. We often believe that the way we feel is because of what happens outside of us. Many therapies focus on treating the antisocial behaviors or changing the patient's thoughts about their circumstances. For example, behavior modification, setting healthy boundaries, and reframing thoughts. These practices can bring some comfort, but as you will read in the accompanying stories, if nothing changes in how we understand how the mind works, then when faced with the same challenges, we fall back into the old habits and a constant need for treatment. Boy, that's so right on. The truth is that we all create our psychological reality from within. Sydney Banks presented the fact that we can only ever feed our thinking about a situation, not the situation itself. We can only ever feel our thinking about a situation. We can't feel the situation. Or everybody would have the same feelings about the same situation, and they don't. We can only feel our own separate thinking about it. The truth is that we all create our psychological reality from within. No two people ever have the exact same reactions to a situation because we're only ever feeling our own personal thoughts about life's experiences. People who go through horrendous abuse, suffering, and even torture don't automatically have the same reactions. This is well documented by researcher Dr. Marilyn Bowman in her amazing book, Individual Differences in Post-Traumatic Response. Many people come out of the Holocaust, for example, and rebuild their lives in communities, while today many are paralyzed purely by the horrors of their anxious imaginations. Sydney Banks was a pioneer in pointing us to the fact that we are all living in a thought-created world, which means there's always the potential to create and experience new psychological realities at any moment simply by understanding how it works. Sid taught that thought is the connection between the seemingly exterior world of experience and the inner spiritual world that brings it all to life. I'm going to read that again. Thought, with a capital T, so meaning the principle of thought, is the connection between the seemingly exterior world of experience and the inner spiritual world that brings it all to life. Understanding this has brought hope to thousands who had been labeled and dismissed as broken and permanently ill. You want to take it from here,
Yes.
Mary?
In his book, Second Chance, Sid wrote that going back in the past from low mood is psychological suicide. In the early 80s, when I was suffering from what is now called PTSD, my family doctor sent me to a psychiatrist in Manchester Royal Infirmary. She asked me to tell my story of violence over and over. As a result of this therapy, I would leave feeling worse than when I arrived. After 2 visits, I decided it wasn't worth the multiple panic attacks it took to get there, and I never went back. Going back,
I just want to interrupt there for a second. She gives that very passing reference, but I don't know how many people on the call know that the author Hannah Studley didn't have it happen once, twice, but 3 times was mugged by men and beaten up. 3 different times in her life. And just, whatever, walking home from a bar one time, she was on a bicycle one time and a gang group of kids wanted the bike, so they beat the pulp out of her. She had a fractured skull at one point, didn't know she had a fractured skull. She really, had and she spent years at home saying going outside is not safe. There are people that will hurt you. And that was true. Most of us have never been mugged once, never mind 3 times. So she just makes such a passing reference to that. But I just thought it was important to underscore that she's not kidding when she talks about PTSD for herself and the impact it had on her life. And the principles weren't the first thing that got her loosened up and better, but they absolutely cemented her understanding of how her experience was created. But anyway, she just gives such a little bit of a taste there. I thought I would just fill it out. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Mary.
thank you. Going back into the past may give temporary relief to some, but could encouraging people in mental distress to go back into the past actually be making it worse. Alcohol, food, and self-harm are certainly unhealthy ways to cope, but could expressive writing, breathing techniques, and a myriad of ways of reframing our thoughts to get through the day actually be an innocently upgraded version of just coping? What if the problem isn't with our past or even our thinking or emotions? What if the fundamental problem, the cause of all mental distress, is really a misunderstanding of the role of thought and how it creates all human experience? What if this is the substantive factor that Dr. Caspi is looking for? So what if Sydney Banks see that? What did Sydney Banks see that Dr. Caspi, Dr. Pies, William James, and Sigmund Freud did not?
Good question. We've got 14 more minutes, so I think we're doing good reading straight through. Do you guys feel like you need anything like a break, or we're good? Keep going. I'm interested.
I'll keep going.
All right.
Yeah, keep going.
All right.
Chapter
Chapter 5.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, you all set?
Yep.
Okay. Chapter 5, One Generic Mental Illness. At the beginning of his Hawaii lecture in a section called Secret to the Mind, Sydney Banks states, I know that we have found the secret to the mind. It's very simple, very, very simple. The more simple, the better. The secret lies in the 3 principles of mind, consciousness, and thought. As I mentioned in the introduction, William James asserted that psychology could not be considered a science until principles were discovered. Principles are often defined as fundamental, primary, or general laws, or truth. As we know, all sciences have principles. Gravity and photosynthesis, for example, are reliable facts. I don't profess to understand much about scientific principles, but interestingly, those principles don't need me to understand them in order for them to be universally true. Gravity was true long before Sir Isaac Newton and Albert Einstein formed their theories. But when we do understand principles, we are able to make better use of them, which in turn makes our lives easier. Understanding germ theory revolutionized healthcare, and thermodynamics led to air travel, transforming lives everywhere. 80 years later, Sydney Banks taught that the principles are universal mind, universal consciousness, and universal thought. Universal mind is the energy of all things, both in the world of form and the spiritual world of the formless. Some call this God or higher power, the quantum field, or Buddha. It really doesn't matter what we call it, but the principles of universal mind points to the fact that there is an intelligent and benevolent source, capital S, to the creation of all things. Universal consciousness is our awareness that changes and deepens from moment to moment, enabling us to interpret our experience. It points to the fact that people are conscious of being alive. Without consciousness, human beings would be unaware of their own existence. Universal thought is a spiritual energy, the raw material from which we create our experience. It can show up in many different forms, from images, sounds, and sensations, as well as all kinds of thinking. The gift of thought can show up in the form of creativity, boredom, or anxiety. Even pain and daydreams come to us via the spiritual energy that Sydney Banks called thought. Hannah really underscored something really important when I first heard her talk about this at, I think it was at 3PGC a couple of years ago, because when she gave the talk, thought went beyond words in my head or concepts that I was thinking, or it came to, oh, I just smelled something. Is that a rotten egg? And it turns out it's not necessarily a rotten egg. Or, oh, I just had a pain in my side. Maybe I've got cancer. So the pain creates, it's gone from formless to form in some result, right? So, and maybe I wouldn't even, some people might feel the pain a lot sooner than I did, and it might not be cancer at all. It could be just gas or whatever. My point is that thought not only is words or concepts, it's sensations, it's music, it's anything that we can interpret, anything that we can make meaning out of, a taste, a sound, or this or that. So like she played a little snippet of an audio, and I can do it for you. And she said, I'm gonna play it. And she hit the button. Donna, 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 Donna. Does anybody know what that is? It's the soundtrack to Jaws, right? So I didn't do a very good job, but if you really heard the audio from the movie, you might go, "Oh, Jaws! I hated that movie. I loved it. It was the best. It was this." But it immediately brings something to mind. It immediately interprets. So that was really useful to me because up until then, when I studied the principles, it was all about my own thinking, my own thoughts, my own brain matter, but there's so much more to thought. So much more stimulus from the world can be interpreted into form, and thought is the energy that does that. It takes something amorphous and makes something out of it in our heads, a sound, a smell, a taste, of this or that. So anyway, I just wanted to comment on that because she's the first one that ever made me go, oh, it's a lot. There's a lot more to this thought than just my own head and my own intellect, if you will, my own concepts.
I love seeing it from the standpoint of a principle. The principle of thought is the ability to create.
Yeah.
And we're creating through, like Wendy said, our interpretations, what we think about the thing or the person or
Right.
ourselves.
Right. And the other thing that maybe is a little bit deeper than this, but I could smell an aftershave and go and get scared. Why am I scared of an aftershave? Because it's the same stuff that the guy who tried to attack me in the train smelled like. And it doesn't even go in my brain. I smell something go and I recoil from fear. That's thought. I've created a memory or a sensation, and it may be a good idea. And like maybe this is the same guy and he's going to attack me again. I'm being silly, but the point is that sometimes thought creates something and it bypasses our intellect. You know how we always say we're feeling our thinking? We can also be feeling our feelings. We can be feeling our smells. We can be feeling other stimuli. It's not just I thought something and oh, I'm sad about that. I'm happy about it. I'm blah 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 blah. But it can come in other ways through the the atmosphere is full of stuff that can be interpreted. Yeah.
Yeah, that's so true. Like every experience from birth to death, every experience, every moment can only come through the principle of thought, the creative
Correct.
principle.
Right.
Yeah,
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's pretty
fascinating,
interesting.
isn't it?
It is. Um, you want to take it from Universal Thought?
Should we keep going even though we only have 6 minutes to go? Does anybody want to make any comments? I kind of
Looks
lost.
like it. Yeah.
I lost track of where we were. We're on
Universal
page
Thought is a
19.
spiritual, yep. Universal Thought, spiritual energy up at the top.
Universal thought is a spiritual energy, the raw material from which we create our experience. It can show up in many different forms, from images, sounds, and sensations, as well as all kinds of thinking. The gift of thought can show up in the form of creativity, boredom, or anxiety. Even pain and daydreams come to us via the spiritual energy that Sydney Banks called thought with a capital T. As Candace Pert observed, the mystical key seems to be the three principles that, as Sid explained to me, hold the secret of the mind and human experience. And that was a quote.
By
Let's
Candace
look
Pert. Yeah.
now
Yeah.
at how this is relevant to Dr. Casby's question. What is that one underlying factor that creates mental illness? Sydney Banks taught us that everyone has innate well-being. Underneath all of our thinking is a fundamental and reliable fact of well-being. It's a very simple idea. But if you look around at your family, friends, colleagues, and clients, you might think this is a ridiculous statement. So many of us are struggling to get through the day. Professional, educated people are needing medication and therapy to deal with everyday lives in greater and greater numbers. So many therapies are based on the concept that this suffering is because we are neither broken, we are either broken
Yeah.
or flawed in some way. From Freudian analysis to EMDR, there is a prevailing idea that we need to be fixed, changed, or are lacking something. Sydney Banks was one of the very few people who saw that underneath the everyday ups and downs of thinking and mind, we all have
And mood.
innate mental health. Everyone, no exceptions. Even the person sitting in a mental institution for 30 years, exclamation point. Innate mental health is common to all human beings. Underneath all that stressful thinking, we are innately well. Dr. R.D. Lang saw this in his schizophrenic patients, but sadly, no one saw back then that the missing link was thought and how thought, capital T, creates our experience until Sydney Banks. So, how is it that so many people feel lost and broken? Dr. Caspi points out that today's patient with schizophrenia was yesterday's boy with conduct disorder or girl with social phobia and tomorrow's elderly person with severe depression. He is identifying a progression, a decline in symptoms, much like the line from the list from the Mayo Clinic. Did you notice how the symptoms got worse as they went down the list? I doubt anyone wakes up one morning and suddenly starts nervously washing their hands hundreds of times for no reason or has extreme debilitating health anxiety out of the blue. I have worked with clients who say that a panic attack just came out of nowhere. But when I asked them what they were doing in the days, hours, or minutes before, they always see that they were sinking into some unhealthy thinking long before the panic attack took hold. If we were to play the video of their experience backward, we would see that stressful thinking always preceded the panic attack. And before that was some disordered thinking. And before that, some unresolved hurt feelings, resentment, or insecurity of some kind. So, what is going on here? Psychiatrist Dr. Bill Pettit states, basically, Without realization of our spiritual nature, people facing adversity often get progressively caught up in the output of their brain and the experience they create. The benevolent alarm symptoms, both psychological and physiological, get louder and louder as epigenetic changes, turning on emergency genes are made in an attempt to maintain survival long enough for the person to have a new realization. Whoa. Good place to stop.
Oh, no,
Any
just the next
comments?
paragraph. The next paragraph he explains what that means. Can you just read one more paragraph?
Okay, I think it looked like somebody was sending us a message. They had to leave, so. Okay, one more.
What Dr. Pettit is saying here is that we are made with incredible wisdom. The spiritual system operating in our minds is an inbuilt healing mechanism. Our bodies are designed with incredible wisdom to heal themselves from a fracture or an infection, but so do our minds. Our minds also have the innate ability to return themselves to well-being. Like a smoke alarm wakes us up to the danger of fire, psychological and physiological changes happen in states of prolonged stress to wake us up and let us know that we're heading in the wrong direction.
woo woo.
Good.
So perfect. So perfect. All right. So we ended here. Today's 11:20. Okay, good.
And I'll post this in our group, so if you have any insights, feel free, please, to comment there. It's a great way
All
to
right.
share what we're realizing as we read.
Yep. All right. I'm on to my 2 o'clock call too.
Yeah,
Thanks.
thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.